Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the food security and nutrition webinar. I'll just present a short presentation. Okay, yeah, I'll put it on slideshow. Can you all see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, so my name is Nomsa Dlamini. I'm a research scientist at CSIR, a principal researcher, specifically in agro-processing, and I'm also currently acting as a manager for the food safety program. In addition, I've worked in the area for more than 20 years, both in academia and research in the last 14 to 15 years. So I've done lots of work in the space of food security, nutrition, community development, and also technology transfer. So in terms of the presentation, it's going to be divided into the background to the webinar. What is the webinar about? I'll set the scene. I'll talk briefly about the roles of partnerships and research in food security. And also we've got a brilliant panelist of speakers. I'll introduce each one of them as we go through their presentations. We've got Dr. Lindwe Dlamini, who's a consulting policy researcher who's got vast experience with United Nations as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We also have Mr. Florian Kroll, who's a food systems researcher, and Dr. Melody Mens-Coetzee, who's also a senior researcher in Food Systems Network of Africa. And then after that, we'll have a first poll of questions, and it's a question and answer. And then we'll have the second and third poll of questions, as well as give closing, and as well as the remarks that to be given by NRF SASTA. In terms of, well, of course, for social media, I'll flight this slide again as we carry on. These are where you can share your tweets or your posts. Use hashtag SA Science Week. You can all see that. Hashtag SW2021 and hashtag IYFF. I'll just explain what it is. It's International Year of Fruits and Vegetables, what this seminar is all about. And you tag at dsi.gov.za, and NRF lower hashtag SASTA. So the webinar on food security and nutrition is part of the DSI-funded National Science Week initiatives for 2021. And this event is coordinated by the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement, SASTA, which is a business unit within the NRF. So the unit basically is tasked with science engagement, which contributes towards the aspirations of NRF Vision 2030, which supports development of scientifically literate and engaged society in order to strengthen the relationship between science and society. You know, without science, the society will suffer, but with just science and no society, also we don't get a good synergy. So this engagement is quite very important. And for you, all of you, for taking part in this one, we thank you for logging in. I hope you managed to access the website, our webinar easily. Also, this event also commemorates the United Nations Declaration of 2021, which is the International Year of Fruits and Vegetables, IYFV, which is very important. We'll pick on this during the presentations by our brilliant panelists of speakers. So basically, just to set the scene, what is food security? Basically, in short, it's defined as that all people at all times must have physical and social, as well as economic access to sufficient, safe food, which is nutritious, and that means their food preferences. Of course, you won't eat food that you don't like, as well as dietary needs. So once we miss one of these, then we have what is called food insecurity. And since our seminar also includes nutrition, what is nutrition? We all know that nutrition is about eating healthy, a balanced diet. It can be either food or drink, depending how you want to take your nutrients. And it's important to understand the various terms of nutrition. Basically, WHO says that nutrition is actually a critical part of health and development, with child development, even maternal health, and even the immune system is also affected if there is deficiency in nutrients that are in the diet. So also, if you look at fruits and vegetables, we know that they play a very important role, particularly in providing some of the nutrients like minerals, vitamins. In addition, they also provide what are called phytochemicals. These are various classes of compounds which include carotenoids, polyphenols, or sulforaphanes, which have potential health benefits and also assist in reducing some non-communicable diseases such as diabetes or even cardiovascular disease and cancer, and will also improve longevity. Global food security, I'll just quickly go through this since the panelists will also cover this. Basically, more than 800 million people in the world. I looked at it, said 900, but I'll quote the United States Agency of International Development, a report of 2018, which says 800 million, which is 1 in 9 people. That is very high. Actually, poverty is cited as one of the causes of hunger. And about half of the world's who reside in sub-Saharan Africa. And I thought, let me blanket. Okay, sorry, I think I lost connection a little bit. Yes, I did lose connection. I'm back now. I will upload my screen again. Can you all see my screen? Sorry. Okay, I was just, can somebody say yes?
Thanks so much.
Yes, sorry, I lost you. My network was just a bit funny. So I was just talking about the Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is zero hunger, which clearly we are not on track. We're clearly not on track with that one, particularly with COVID-19 pandemic, which is exacerbating the situation, and it was set to worsen the hunger levels. So it will affect. But with appropriate policies and programs, we'll try and address this situation of hunger, particularly looking at Africa as a whole. We have the Africa Strategy 2063, which also looking at ways of improving food security, as well as national development policies that have been put in place towards eliminating some of these present global challenges. In South Africa, we have the National Development Plan, which is also in place. The main objective of the webinar, as you are all aware, is to profile food security research, which contributes to zero hunger and no poverty. That is our ultimate aim. What is the role of fruits and vegetables in our food systems, and how can it be explored and linked to food security? And with food security comes also nutrition security. Like as I mentioned again, I'll flight this page, social media, please be active, tweet and do posts. And our first speaker is Dr. Lindiwe Dlamini, who's a consulting policy researcher. She has experience working with the United Nations in the regional and global level. And she's also been involved in her work has also informed some of the development of sustainable goals for United Nations. And she has been part of the SDG team that led UN's input into South Africa's SDG baseline report, and was part of the technical team mapping the National Development Plan. So Dr. Lindiwe Dlamini will give us her talk. In terms of her background, she holds an MBA from the University of Witwatersrand, as well as a Bachelor of Commerce and Risk Management from the University of South Africa. As you can see, she comes with a lot of experience and leadership and development in the private sector, as well as in the public sectors. So, Dr. Lindiwe, I give over to you to start our presentation.
Thank you, Nomusa.
I'll stop sharing so that you can share. Should I stop sharing? Okay, okay, yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Lindiwe.
Okay. Share my screen. Okay, can we see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Thank you, Lindiwe.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Today, I'll be presenting on South Africa's progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDGs 1 and 2. I will give us, okay, I'm trying to move to the next slide. Okay, I'll start off with a brief background and introduction, speak on South Africa's involvement in Agenda 2030, South Africa's progress on the SDGs so far, and then delve into SDGs 1 and 2's progress before we conclude. So the Brundtland Commission cites that development is sustainable if it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to satisfy their own needs. At the United Nations Summit in September 2015, 193 of its member states adopted the new agenda called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that incorporates the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. The SDGs contain 17 goals, 169 targets, and 230 indicators, with an aim to harmonize the three interconnected elements of social inclusion, economic growth, and environmental protection. So we see here all 17 goals, and today we're looking into the first two goals. The new goals and targets came into effect on the 1st of January 2016 and are to guide decisions that the international community will take from 2015 up to 2030. The goals will also stimulate action in areas of critical importance including the 5 Ps that we see illustrated in the figure on the right. P speaks of people, to ensure healthy lives, knowledge, and the inclusion of women and children. Next, the second P is planet, to protect our ecosystems from all societies and future generations. We see prosperity, to grow a strong, inclusive, and transformative economy. Next, we see peace, to promote safe and peaceful societies. And the last P is on partnerships, to catalyze global solidarity for sustainable development. So now we will speak of South Africa's involvement in Agenda 2030, and this brings into the figure on the left into play. To address its triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, South Africa launched its National Development Plan, Vision 2030, in September 2012. It serves as an action plan to guide the country's development until 2030. We are showing here the NDP's cycle of development. In the center, we see that we need strong leadership, active citizenry, and effective government with the right conditions, opportunities, and capabilities, resulting in employment growth, poverty reduction, rising living standards, and social cohesion. The NDP formed the country's leadership role in continental and global processes and agendas. It was under the chairpersonship of Dr. Mbosa Zuma that the African Union in May 2013 laid down a vision for the Africa we want, which included 8 ideals that were then later translated into 7 aspirations of Agenda 2063. It was thereafter in late September 2015, on the sidelines during the UN General Assembly, that South Africa was elected Minister of the G7 in 2015. So this translates ahead of member states adopting Agenda 2030 for sustainable development and the SDG. I was part of the technical team that worked with government to do a mapping of the NDP to the UN and AU agendas, with a report recently launched by the National Planning Commission. The report infers is continental and global processes that culminated in the adoption of both Agendas 2063 by the AU and 2030 by UN member states, using its NDP as a reference point. A rapid integrated conducted.
Sorry, Dr. Lindy, it seems like the audience is maybe not hearing you. I see on the group. I'm not sure if you can just close our ears. Thank you so much.
Wow, sorry about that. Okay, closer. Where should I start?
Yes, it sounds very good. Thank you so much, Lindy.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just start here with a rapid integrated assessment was conducted, and it showed that the NDP and the SDGs are highly aligned with a convergence ratio of 74%. And this means that 74% of the SDG targets are covered by the NDP, and the remaining 26%, which are 44 targets on the SDGs, are not covered within the framework of the NDP, but out of those 44, 32 are addressed comprehensively in other programs running in parallel to the NDP. So it's actually only 12 SDGs targets that are not applicable in the South African context. Okay, so now we will discuss South Africa's progress on the SDGs so far. There was a national coordination mechanism that was started for national engagements and reporting on Agendas 2030 and 2063 in alignment with the NDP. South Africa has reported on its headway in 3 different reports that we see here. Firstly, it was the 2017 SDGs Indicator Baseline Report. So I was part of the UN SDGs team that led the organization's input into this report and also helped to galvanize greater participation from civil society. Following that, in 2019, we had the voluntary national review. So a VNR is done by countries globally, voluntarily, and then are presented to the UN high-level political forum to share on the country's progress. Then lastly, in 2019, the SDGs country report was produced, and we'll park here for a little bit. According to StatsSA, the objective of the report was to synthesize findings from 4 identified thematic reports, these being on social, economic, environment, then lastly, peace, justice, and security. The social thematic section gives a synthesis of what are deemed the social SDGs. And these are the SDGs from goals 1 to goals 5. These 5 SDGs are interrelated, and the challenge that cuts across them all is the need to address poverty. And it's in this view that poverty is treated as the central issue for synthesis in this thematic section. The social theme goals are the most widely covered goals within the NDP as compared to the goals from the other 3 themes. We're going to now delve into 2 specific goals within this thematic section, mostly based on this report. So we see here SDG 1 that seeks to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. SDG 1 calls for an end to poverty in all its manifestations by 2030. It also aims to ensure social protection for the poor and vulnerable. It seeks to increase access to basic services and support people harmed by climate-related extreme events and other economic, social, and environmental shocks and disasters. It contains 7 targets and 14 indicators in total. The NDP is fundamentally geared towards the elimination of poverty and the reduction of inequality in South Africa, as articulated by SDG 1. StatsSA, in line with the UN, defines absolute poverty as a condition characterized by severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education, and information. So to reduce poverty, South Africa has since the year 2000 been assisted by one of its key programs, this being the rapid expansion of social grants. Social grants provide financial assistance to 17 million South Africans. StatsSA surveys show that the elderly is covered comprehensively, with 71.9% of all older persons receiving an old age grant in 2015. And in addition to that, about 92.2% of those classified as poor receive grants. Approximately a third of households with children are covered by child support grants, with poor households having notably higher coverage at 61.3%. A study in 2016-2017 by POSEL found social grants to have significant impact on reducing poverty in South Africa. And the study went on to find that without social grants, poverty would be 8% higher than the current level. The 2019 country report shows that the number of social grants has increased and that government spending on essential services remains high, but that access to services seems to be on the decline, which is an issue. The war on poverty is far from over, and efforts to combat poverty must be expanded and accelerated as the country experienced increased levels of poverty between 2011 and 2015. According to the Poverty Trends in South Africa report, we see women, children, Black South Africans, those living in rural areas, and people with little or no education remain the main victims of poverty. These groups require special focus and targeted interventions if poverty levels are to drop to the SDG targets of 20% by 2030. This is coming from 40% in 2015. based on the lower bound poverty line. So this is the severe threshold below which a person has to choose between food and important non-food items, and is currently standing at 840 Rand based on April 2020 prices. Using the international poverty line of $1.90 a day, the 2019 VNR states that South Africa performed quite well in reducing poverty by 55%. Another international measure of poverty is the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, and it was in 2014 that South Africa published its own official South African Multidimensional Poverty Index, whereby alongside the 3 dimensions used by the global MPI, these being health, education, and living standards, the SAMPI includes a 4th dimension on economic activity using unemployment as the indicator. We see here, it is made up of 11 indicators across these 4 dimensions, and with the ultimate aim to ensure that we leave no one behind. SDG target 1.2 and indicator 122 that we see on the screen are used for the SAMPI. This poverty index is presented in 2 measures in terms of headcount and poverty intensity. The data on the SAMPI headcount shows a steady decline between 2001 and 2016, going from 17.9 in 2001 to 7 in 2016, and the SAMPI intensity similarly declined from 43.9 in 2001 to 42.8 in 2016. Next, we see SDG 2. This seeks to end hunger, to achieve food security and improve nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture. SDG 2 aims to end hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030. It also commits to universal access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food at all times of the year. This will require sustainable food production systems and resilient agricultural practices, equal access to land, technology, and markets, and international cooperation on investments in infrastructure and technology to boost agricultural productivity. It contains 8 targets and 14 indicators, and in relation to SDG 2, South Africa has a food poverty line. This is the threshold of absolute deprivation, commonly cited as the extreme poverty line. It refers to the amount that an individual will need to afford the minimum required daily energy intake. So this is standing at 585 per person, 85 Rand per person per month, and is also based on the April 2020 prices. According to South Africa's SDGs baseline report, food security is more than just the availability of food. It also encapsulates issues of affordability, nutrition or food utilization, and stability of food supply into the future. The NDP indicates that food security exists when everyone has access to sufficient, nutritious, and safe food at all times. This implies that food must be available and that people must have the means to access it. The NDP goes on to acknowledge that the ability to access food rather than its availability is actually key towards determining the food security of households and individuals. The call to ensure food security is a constitutional mandate. It's stated in Section 27(1) of the Bill of Rights that says that every citizen has a right to have access to food and water. And then Section 28(1)(c) speaks of every child having the right to basic nutrition, shelter, basic healthcare, and social services. In 2002, Cabinet approved the National Integrated Food Security Strategy to streamline, harmonize, and integrate the diverse food security programs, and the country was able to boast national food sufficiency through a combination of own production and food imports. It was in 2013 that the country approved its national policy on food and nutrition security, which has 6 strategic objectives and aims to ensure food security at both the national and the household levels. This policy seeks to provide an overarching guiding framework to maximize synergy amongst the different strategies and programs of both government and civil society. We find that the NDP identifies food and nutrition security as a key element of both poverty and inequality. It is both a consequence of poverty and inequality as well as a cause. Right? So as a result, the NDP refers to numerous steps that will improve food security, including the expanded use of irrigation, security of land tenure, especially for women, and the promotion of nutrition education. Therefore, the 2013 National Policy on Food and Nutrition Security will be an important pillar in achieving the objectives of the NDP. Regarding the progress made in the country to end hunger, we see about 3/4 of the population had been food secure in 2008, showing an improvement of roughly 50% from 2005. StatSa's 2017 General Household Survey indicates that there was a decline in the percentage of households that are vulnerable to hunger by more than half, from 24.2% in 2002 to 10.4% in 2017. Equally, the proportion of people vulnerable to hunger decreased from 29.3% to 12.1%, also between 2002 and 2017. The World Bank suggests that one of the contributing factors towards the attainment of this outcome is South Africa's commitment towards social assistance, the country being the leading country on the continent, allocating the most to social assistance, 3% as a proportion of its GDP. Despite the progress that South Africa is making, the country still faces challenges. And according to StatSA, over 3 million households are reported to have run out of money to buy food at the end of 2016, of which 90.8% were Black South Africans. As a high priority, South Africa needs to address food insecurity going forward. According to our previously mentioned 2013 policy, food and nutrition security is a multifaceted and multidimensional issue, which won't be attained through a single approach. It needs well-managed intersectoral coordination and the sincere integration of existing policies and programs in health, education, and environmental protection, as well as in agrarian reform and agricultural development. This is very much like the SDGs. Although we've looked at the first 2 goals, the SDGs overall are interrelated, interlinked, or interconnected. And this means that progress on one goal will filter and impact progress on other goals. The Food and Agriculture Organization has produced a background paper, with 2021 being declared by the UN as the International Year of Fruits and Vegetables. This is partly due to why we're here today. Transforming the fruit and vegetable sector needs a holistic and comprehensive approach that looks at interconnectivity between demand, supply, socio-economic development, and the fruit and vegetables prices, which is a major determinant of consumer behavior. So in this regard, the SDGs support making the food system more productive, environmentally sustainable, and resilient. We are at the tail end of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. This is 2016 to 2025, but have just started the UN Decade of Family Farming, 2019 to 2028. So last year in 2020, we actually marked the start of the decade of action to deliver the SDGs by 2030. We are currently in an important time to advance a shared vision and fast-track responses to the world's weightiest challenges. So from eliminating poverty and hunger to reversing climate change. South Africa has just started the process towards its next SDGs country report, and having given the above progress update and possibly considering what might be included in the next report, we can't ignore the global pandemic that is the coronavirus or COVID-19 and its impact on the country. The already high levels of poverty in the country have been magnified over the past 18 months, especially for the self-employed and the informal sector. And another incident possibly worth mentioning is the South Africa specific looting that took place early in July in mostly the KZN and Gauteng provinces, hard hitting the already ailing economy. In response, the finance minister at a briefing mentioned that the looting probably caused about 50 billion rands worth of damage. And he went on to confirm South Africa's 36 billion rand relief package to help businesses and individuals deal with impacts of both COVID-19 and the unrest. We are 1/3 of the way into our SDGs journey globally, and the world at large is not on track to achieve the global goals by 2030. I implore us all participating in this webinar, whether government, civil society, private sector, development partners, academia, etc. I implore us to contribute to the restructuring and rebuilding of our country at this time, ultimately ensuring that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindiwe, for that very insightful presentation. Please, audience, keep your questions coming. They are on the chat. I've seen a few that we may respond to. Yeah, maybe as a way forward, we'll proceed to the next speaker. I'll just put on my slide and share the profile of the next speaker. Sorry. No, back to India. Yes. Our next speaker is Mr. Florian Krol, who's a food systems researcher with an interest in biopolitics of urban food systems and governance in African systems. He's worked with the WITS Health Promotion Unit to promote agroecology, nutrition, as well as conducted urban food security and policy evaluations in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Gauteng. He's collaborated with the Southern Africa Food Lab that has interest in social innovation and dialogues. He's also an alumnus of International Visitor Leadership Program on food security policy, food security and foreign policy. And he currently works for University of Western Cape, School of Public Health, and also for the Center of Excellence in Food Security. Well, he's facilitated multi-stakeholder dialogues like this one, and as well with the Western Cape and Gauteng communities. And he's currently a PhD candidate with the Institute of Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. We wouldn't have had a better speaker than this one. Florian, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'll be sharing my screen with you quickly. Once the screen is visible, I'll be continuing with my actual presentation. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Flo, and that's what most of my friends and colleagues call me. So if there are any questions later on, please use that name. So thanks for the previous speaker as well for highlighting the importance of the SDGs. And my speech, I just want to be clear that this relates to SDG 1, poverty, SDG 2, hunger, obviously, but also SDG 3, health, and then SDGs 10 and 11 in terms of equality and sustainable cities. And I think this is a really important point, that as long as we have huge concentrations of poor people in the cities, and thus also high concentrations of food insecurity in the cities, we can't consider the cities sustainable either. And this is one of the big limitations of the SDGs, in fact, that the link between sustainable cities and the hunger and poverty and inequality SDGs hasn't been clarified. In any case, I'm going to be speaking really about hunger and food systems concentration as risks to public health and to security. I think it's really important first to be clear about what I'm talking about when I'm speaking about food systems. And here you can see the image right at the top, where you can see on the left-hand side, things begin at the farm, moving from there to processing and packaging, to the factory, to the warehouse, via trucks to supermarkets, to our shopping trolley, and ultimately to our dinner plate. And I think when we're looking at transforming food systems, we need to keep all of those stages in mind. The tendency when speaking about food security has been really for people in research and also in the state to emphasize the importance of agriculture. But that is really only the start of things. And if we really want to shift things, we need to look more broadly. But before I proceed, I felt it's really also important to highlight that my background really is as a policy researcher and a governance researcher. And very often when we think about research, we emphasize technology, we emphasize the kinds of research that help us figure out what can be done and how to do it. Well, the social sciences, and particularly political science, is really interested in what we ought to be doing, what we should be doing. And as the previous speaker has pointed out, we really do have some serious issues in this country still, despite progress having been made, concerning food insecurity. And on the bottom left-hand side of the slide, you'll see some of the really worrying statistics of the current food insecurity problem in our country. Close to 7 million people having experienced hunger in South Africa in 2017. And also highlighting that our unemployment is unacceptably high at this stage, and that many people are too poor actually to be able to afford food. We're looking at about 60% of people who can't afford to buy even a basic nutritious basket of food. And that the cost of essential foods has increased quite significantly, as revealed by some community-led surveys conducted by the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Development Group. The COVID lockdown crisis has exacerbated this. We've seen that a lot of people have lost their income as a result of the lockdown. And we also see that as a result of this, almost half of the households that were interviewed by the recent NIDS-CRAM survey reported not having enough money to buy food after the first lockdown. And this figure remains really, really high. I've already spoken to the issue of urban food insecurity. I just want to emphasize that again. And to say that as a result of all of these converging issues, we are finding that there's a growing problem with obesity, which is also gendered in the sense that women are far more affected by this problem than men. So these are all issues that can't really be solved just by improving the technology in agriculture and by producing more or by improving efficiency. In fact, it requires a fundamental reconfiguration of the food system as a whole. And also for us to look at another concept, which is called food environments, which essentially is all the different shops, the spazas, the supermarkets, the street traders, through whom people access food locally, where they live, where they work, in the spaces that they commute through. Now, in order to promote transition to these, to a better future for food systems, we need different forms of governance that can really tackle some of these problems at their root. But before I go on to that, I feel it's perhaps useful to emphasize some of the fundamental economic issues that we're facing. And that really is epitomized by the problem of big food. And what we have here, and this is really the point about concentration in the food system, is that our food system as an economy is controlled by a small number of extremely powerful corporations, some of which are transnational corporations like Unilever or Coca-Cola, but others that are also local. And that in the kind of reasoning of these corporations, shareholder interests dominate. In other words, people are interested in maximizing their profit and accumulating this profit after extracting value from the local economy. And essentially producers, the farmers and consumers are price takers, and prices are often set by these intermediary organizations. And from an economic perspective and in terms of sustainability, we often speak about this notion of externalized costs. In other words, while these corporations accumulate profit, which then is siphoned off to international finance corporations, locally we're experiencing job losses. Where there is work or employment, it's often exploitative. And the core of the food sector relies on a periphery that is largely informal to sell its goods at minimal profit. We're also harvesting an entirely problematic result in the sense of environmental destruction through farming, through packaging, through food waste, through the pollution of rivers. And the other key point is really that all of this is leading to a massive public health crisis, which has huge economic costs for society and for the state. And this next slide really speaks to that. And one of the key problems within that is this tendency, which is happening globally, but in South Africa is very advanced compared to other African countries, is the rise of ultra-processed foods. Now, these are foods that are composed of multiple highly refined industrial ingredients. And they entail high concentrations of sugar, salt, unhealthy fats, colorants, flavorants, preservatives, but they have very little by way of fiber and micronutrients and the phytochemicals that my colleague alluded to in the introduction to this webinar. So why do people eat them? Well, partly it's they're cheap and affordable. Partly they have a long shelf life. They are packaged in ways that are really attractive. And there is also an aspirational element to this because by consuming these foods, people have a sense of participating in the broader economy and of having made it in this sense. But the other issue here is also that these foods are formulated to be very tasty and in fact to be almost addictive because of all the sugars and salts and fats. And for the corporations, it makes a lot of sense because they are easy to make. They can be made in bulk. In fact, the way that they are composed is a result of those industrial processes. And they can be kept in warehouses almost indefinitely, can be shipped long distances. So they're very suited to long distance trade. And we're in fact noting how the South African industry, the food industry, is exporting a lot of these really harmful products to the rest of Africa. And recently I was on a research trip to Ghana, and lo and behold, in Kumasi, I walked into a ShopRite, which had recently been established there. And anyone who's recently been in a ShopRite, I'd like to remind you, next time you go there, have a look around, consider how much of the floor space and the shelf space is taken up by these kinds of foods. And what we're essentially saying with food environments, and particularly the food environments in shopping centers and in supermarkets, is that the way that these retail corporations make food visible, how they lay out their shops, which products they place in which positions, how they fill their shelves, those are all sophisticated and carefully thought through strategies to maximize consumer interest in those products and ensure that people buy these things. They don't just happen to be there. Now, very often when we raise these issues with policymakers and even with people from these corporations, they say, you know, isn't it patronizing to try and tell consumers what they are and aren't allowed to buy? Isn't it patronizing to tell the private sector what we're able to sell? After all, it's just, you know, supply and demand. The consumers demand this, and if we don't supply it, they'll buy it somewhere else. But I think that this is really a misleading argument, deliberately misleading, because in fact, most retailers have, you know, very sophisticated strategies and devote millions of rands towards shaping consumer behavior through advertising, through marketing, and through the way that they organize their shops. Now, if there wasn't a clear public health risk, this wouldn't be so much of an issue. But in fact, there are clear links between ultra-processed foods and obesity. And when I speak about obesity, it's not about the looks, really. It's really that obesity is a predictor for a number of non-communicable diseases, these NCDs, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And these are issues which are on the rise throughout South Africa and are affecting millions of people. And when we speak about diabetes, I think it's important to bear in mind what we're actually talking about is people going blind, people having their legs and arms amputated. When we're talking about cancers, we're talking about people experiencing extremely painful and slow deaths ultimately. And if you look at some of the Stats SA publications, particularly the publications around the burden of disease, you will find there that there are actually numbers of people dying every year from different illness classes. And I recently had a look at just what's happening in Cape Town. And when I add up the numbers of people that are dying from circulatory disorders, heart diseases, from endocrine disorders, and from things that are explicitly nutritional, it comes to more than half of the annual deaths. So in fact, the ultra-processed goods and the hunger that we're experiencing and the fact that people survive off of mealie meal and sugar and Coca-Cola and polony and white bread and Simba chips is actually accruing a massive body count. And this is an issue of significant public concern. This is an issue which the state really needs to take quite seriously. And so part of what I want to advocate for in this speech here, in this talk, is that the state should take on a much more aggressive and decisive role in regulating these industries and in meeting its obligations in terms of the Constitution to not only ensure that everyone has access to food that is healthy, but also to ensure that people, that citizens and residents of South Africa enjoy a safe and healthy environment. So there's two specific clauses within the Constitution, Section 24 and Section 27, that speak directly to this. And so there is a constitutional mandate here that the state needs to step into quite decisively in order to ensure that people have access to the kinds of food that they need. Now, recent events have shown just how important food security is, also from the perspective of public safety and security. Hunger and food insecurity, we know, exacerbate social tensions and prime poverty-stricken populations for political opportunism, so that various different interest groups politically can exploit the hunger and food insecurity in ways that mobilize them for political purposes of particular factions and groupings. And this is not unique to South Africa. This is something we see across the world. And yeah, I like to remind people also that this is something which brought about major social upheavals in Europe. For example, the French Revolution. One of the nobles there, Marie Antoinette, was famously quoted as saying, once when she was told that the peasants were revolting because they can't afford bread, she just said, well, let them eat cake. And this is really reflective of the way in which elites are quite often insulated from the poverty and the food insecurity that affects the masses, and that there is a real need to take this seriously. We also know that chronic malnutrition, particularly during gestation and early childhood, compromises cognitive development in such a way that individuals later in life are more ready to engage in acts of violence. And also that many acts of gender-based violence are linked to hunger and food insecurity. But it's also a strategic security risk in the sense that the way that our food system currently is organized means that we have very centralized facilities for food distribution, such as the distribution centers and large malls, such as the one that we can see burning on the bottom left-hand side from the recent upheavals in KwaZulu-Natal. But also highways and shopping malls. These are all strategic targets that can be easily targeted. And once they've been disrupted in this way, they can make access to food really, really difficult. And in KwaZulu-Natal, we've seen how many small towns and cities experience major issues in being able to supply its populations with sufficient food. But there's also an element here that is relevant to the many foreign shop owners, and small businesses in particular are vulnerable to xenophobic attacks and looting. So I've just outlined how food insecurity is a massive strategic risk, both in terms of the concentration and how that exposes urban populations in particular to food shortages through disruption of infrastructure, but also how it's got this long-term impact on public health that is causing many deaths every year. Now, we really need a far more resolute and more democratic food governance. One of the key points really that I'd like to emphasize is that we need national government to create a strong mandate for local governments to regulate urban food systems and urban food environments. They need to play a far stronger role in reining in big food. And again, this requires action by national government, but also by provincial and local governments who can play major roles in regulating big food through, for example, planning provisions, approving shopping mall developments, making certain requirements in terms of floor space allocation. And particularly here, I think there are opportunities to promote small farmers, small processors and transporters and retailers by just making provisions in local government regulations and provincial government regulations for the design and approval, for example, of shopping malls, but also for the development of fresh produce markets. In South Africa, the malls really are a private space, but they're considered almost as a public space. And we saw many people being up in arms by the fact that these malls were targeted in this way. But in fact, that we have this situation that our food retail is concentrated in privatized spaces reflects also a failure of government to provide safe, secure, and hygienic retail spaces for informal traders, for food traders, and also for small farmers. But we also need to look at real solid measures to penalize the sale and advertisement of ultra-processed food, and at measures that can lower the price of fresh produce by making sure that we produce more of it and that we produce it closer to our cities. And this also means there's an urgent need to look at land reform, particularly around the cities, to make smaller parcels of land available to a far larger number of smallholder farmers who could then feed into the cities and supply them with fresh fruit and vegetables, so that we can encourage people to consume more whole plant-based foods, which we know are one of the essential factors that can help prevent a lot of the non-communicable diseases that are causing such a lot of upheaval and trouble in our communities. So yeah, I hope that I've provided a somewhat provocative and sharp critique of our current food governance environment, and that some of what I've shared today would spark participants here to look at more proactive ways of getting involved in food governance and in holding not only the state to account, but also the private sector to account. And one of the ways in which we're doing this in the Western Cape currently is by convening communities of practice for food governance, which incorporate stakeholders from local and provincial government, as well as researchers, as well as people from civil society, which has played a major role in helping to curb the hunger and food insecurity linked to the lockdown. And so I think the mobilization of civil society will also play a major role in democratizing how food is governed and in holding the various powerful players to account so that we can transition to a food economy, a food system that promotes health, that promotes equity, and that promotes resilience and sustainability. All right, and that is the end of my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian, for that thought-provoking presentation. We all, I suppose Florian has shown us the other side of food processing, as well as what we can do about it, especially with the focus on processed foods. They tend to be high in sugar, high in salt, and high in agri fat. But what I can say is that in South Africa, and I suppose in the world over, at least we've made progress in terms of reducing salt content of specific foods, where industry really had to think hard about then how do you replace, you know, salt is there for technological reasons as a preservative, is there to enhance taste. How then do we replace salt with other ingredients? So it has led to a lot of innovations and a lot of research with universities. Also looking at sugar, the sugar tax has introduced some aspects. I see you flouted Coca-Cola there. I know they tried a sugar-free Coke where they replaced the sugar with stevia, but I suppose that product didn't last for too long. And of course, trying to, you know, it's so appropriate that this is the International Year of Fruits and Vegetables. The fresher the food, the preferable it is. But we know in most cases, people cannot access fresh fruits or fresh vegetables. But with other initiatives, for example, the vegetable gardens, school gardens or community gardens, we can access those fresh vegetables. Fruits take a little bit longer, but then I'll give over to my next speaker, who will also talk about partnerships that improve our food systems. Dr. Melody Coetzee, I'll just share my screen just to profile her. Just her profile, sorry. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Suppose you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Melody Coetzee is the senior researcher in the Food Systems Network for Africa. And it's a program within the African Research University Alliances as the Centers of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems, and they are housed at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Coetzee has vast experience in monitoring and evaluation as an evaluation practitioner, focusing on theory-based mixed methods, approaches, and evaluation of research and capacity development initiatives in Africa, with an emphasis on gender. She currently leads monitoring and evaluation learning efforts within the African network, and her research for the past 5 years has focused on capacity development and strengthening of early career researchers. I happen to know one of these early career researchers, which is a good thing. Dr. Coetzee has also co-authored on national and international publications and has several research chapters. Before I say a lot, I'll give over to her to give us her brilliant presentation today. Thank you, Dr. Coetzee, for giving us this chance to engage with you.
Thank you so much, Nomusa, and good afternoon to everybody. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to share with you today some of the work that we're doing at the Arua Center of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems. And I really have to thank the speakers who've presented before me. In many ways, it feels as if we planned all of these presentations together to build the message. It's worked out quite beautifully. And I think, I hope that what I will talk about today will add a perspective around what are some of the things that we can do. And specifically, what are some of the ways that we can really build this relationship between science and society. And by building that relationship, what are some of the ways that we can actually work about addressing the many challenges that are in the food system? So Lindiwe gave us a great overview of SDG 1 and 2, specifically in the South African context. And what I want to also just point out on this slide is, as she mentioned, all of the Sustainable Development Goals are really interrelated to each other. And so when you have something positive happening in one, you can have positive knock-off effects in another. But also challenges in one area related to some of the goals can have negative knock-on effects in other areas. And so that makes it really tricky and really difficult for us to achieve complicated and complex challenges such as the SDGs. And if we look at this picture, we can see that in one or other way, either food or agriculture is related to all of the 17 SDGs. And so everything that we do in food systems has an impact on various aspects of development. And not achieving SDGs in other areas can really undermine our goals to have sustainable and transformed food systems. So at the Arua Center for Sustainable Food Systems, our philosophy is that it can't just be business as usual, that we really do need to find new ways for tackling some of these really complicated challenges. And that means that we have to think and act in ways that we haven't necessarily always been doing before. So just a quick note about our center. We are a virtual collaborative center housed at the University of Pretoria, but in partnership with the universities of Nairobi and Ghana. And all of Arua's centers actually are set up as cross-country collaborations where researchers from different countries work together around a big challenge theme. And in our case, that theme is sustainable food systems. The centers are really structured in this way because when you're dealing with really complicated, really challenging problems like hunger, like malnutrition, it is really difficult for any single researcher, any single institution, or any single role player to be able to find all of the solutions. And so the idea is that we build partnerships between different research universities, but also between universities and different stakeholders to be able to solve some of these challenges together. And so in the center, our vision focuses on doing cutting edge research because we do believe that science really has a big role to play in achieving the SDGs, but also on building capacities because we need a generation of researchers who are ready and equipped to be able to do this type of research. Our vision focuses on building networks and partnerships so that we can also increase the visibility of African science across the globe. And then very importantly, to build those partnerships and relationships with stakeholders within the food system. So that it's not just scientists sitting on their own trying to solve challenges, but that we're working with stakeholders from the farmer all the way through to the policymaker. And I loved the visual that Florian shared, where he showed so nicely different aspects of the food system and how all of those stakeholders are involved in making sure that a food system is sustainable. So just very briefly, a quick overview of some of our research focus areas at the center. We've got 4 main focus areas. The one is focused on improving Africa's herds. The second is on unleashing the potential of Africa's crops. We have a research focus area that is focused on nutrition. So that's how do we deliver sufficient, safe, nutritious, and consumer-driven foods. And then a focus area that's looking at evidence-led policy. Capacity building is really integrated into all of our different activities, but we have 2 very specific projects that have a specific focus on capacity building. And these are the 2 flagship projects within our center. And you can see the one is FSNet Africa. So this is the project where I'm primarily working, and the other is CAB Foods Africa. Both of these projects are funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, and they work in different ways to build the capacity of scientists working in food systems issues. In CAB Foods Africa, the focus is on training courses. So we've been developing training materials and offering courses. It's a combination of online and face-to-face, but focusing on topics such as nutrition, post-harvest losses, and then also on how do we integrate big data into our research around food systems and agriculture. FSNet Africa takes a bit of a different approach to capacity building. And in FSNet Africa, we've got 2-year fellowships where early career researchers can participate in the fellowship. It's a research-focused fellowship, but with the research, they participate in several training opportunities. And the idea really is that we want to help build and grow scientists who are able to do interdisciplinary work. So if you're trying to solve really complicated challenges like the ones we've been talking about today, we have to bring people of different disciplines together. The fellowship also helps build networks for our researchers and then helps to develop skills to translate research and communicate research effectively. So as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, we really have a strong emphasis on building networks and building long-term collaborations because it's through those networks and those collaborations that we can identify the right partners to work with and build up those relationships that can continue the work. And so our flagship projects really help us do that at the moment. In FSNet Africa, for example, we're working with 10 different universities across the continent to implement our fellowship. They're coming from 6 different African countries. And from these academic partners, we've actually selected 20 research fellows who are forming part of our first cohort. Each of our fellows is linked to 2 mentors. And those mentors are from different disciplines than they're working in. One mentor comes from an African university partner and one from the University of Leeds. And then each of these research teams is also linked to the university, to a researcher at the University of Pretoria. And so what all of that means is that through our model, we have been able to connect 80 researchers from 7 different countries to each other within the fellowship. So this aspect has really helped us put together a strong network of collaborators on the research side. But as I mentioned, for us, it's really important that we integrate engagement with stakeholders and building relationships with stakeholders into all of our activities as well. And when I talk about stakeholders, as I mentioned, it's everybody from the farmer through to the producers, the processors, retailers, community, consumers, and policymakers. So we in FSNet Africa are working with one of our lead partners, Vanderpan, to connect all of our research teams, our network of 80, to a network of food systems stakeholders. So Vanderpan is the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network. They're based in South Africa, but they are operating at a Pan-African level. And in 17 countries, Vanderpan has a country-based node. And the nodes are a network of food system stakeholders within that country. So really, Vanderpan helps us connect to a node, and the node has this really wide network of stakeholders at the country level. And by linking our research teams to the nodes, we're able to link our researchers to food systems stakeholders. And the idea is that our research then can be designed, developed, implemented, and then put into practice and taken up in collaboration with food system stakeholders. And we've tried to think differently about how do we make sure that this actually happens. I think we often see excellent research that is done, but it's done in isolation from stakeholders. And so then when that research is published and communicated, it doesn't necessarily have as much impact or as much value. And so in our fellowship, we are connecting our network of researchers to the stakeholders from the very beginning. When our teams participate in orientation activities, we help them to first conduct a stakeholder mapping and then actually connect them to the stakeholders to have conversations. At our intensive bootcamp summer schools, stakeholders and Vanderpan nodes participate in activities, and also Vanderpan leads some of our training to really help our young researchers grow the skills that they need to be able to engage with stakeholders effectively and also to be able to communicate effectively outside of the research space. And then one other example about how we're really trying to integrate this engagement and the relevance of the research work that we're doing is that our research teams are expected to publish in academic publications, which is what is typically expected in the science sphere, but also they need to be able to produce a policy-related brief that really helps them think through and create awareness around the ways that their research can add value to policy. And I think Florian's presentation really gave us an excellent example of how research can really have that relevance to policy. He highlighted some actionable points that could be taken up, things that we could tangibly do that would help have a contribution. And so we want to be able to train our researchers to be able to communicate their research and identify those ways in the same manner that Florian has so articulately done in his presentation today. But for many of us working in the science world, that skill doesn't come very easily. Florian made it look incredibly easy today because of how well he was able to communicate his message to us. But it's not always easy for scientists to do that. And so what we at FSNet Africa want to be able to do is help our young researchers get these kind of skills that they need to be able to communicate and have an impact. So to summarize, I think the key message is if we really want to tackle the SDGs and if we want to have science and society work together to be able to effectively identify interventions that could be put in place, we really need to think about new ways of thinking, new ways of building capacity for research and policy work, but then also about new partnerships, and not just new partnerships, but new partnerships that really add value. So connecting the right people to each other at the right time so that together they can help work towards identifying some impactful solutions that can achieve food system sustainability, but also then make sure that the system stays resilient into the future. So I really thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our work and the ways that we're trying to build these types of new partnerships and build the next generation of food systems researchers in South Africa, but also more broadly across the continent. I look forward to continuing this conversation in our Q&A.
Thank you, Melody, for that brilliant presentation. And definitely food security is not a one-man job or one-man show. It involves partnership, it involves collaboration, training, developing, and the fact that you are working across Africa. Africa has got tremendous potential. There is so much that we haven't even tapped into in Africa alone in terms of fruits. I know fruits is one of the areas where we really need to work on indigenous fruits. I know South Africa is an exporter of many exotic fruits. I mean, if you go to New York, you go to Paris, you will find apples from South Africa or avocados from South Africa. But we know we've got tremendous wealth of indigenous fruits. Marula is one of them. At least it has made into the international scene. But before taking too long of your time, I'll ask then to have the first poll questions posted out. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yes. So in your opinion, to what extent do you think the recent unrest in South Africa have negatively impacted food systems in terms of production, processing, packaging, consumption, and waste? I think that's the first poll question. So you can vote, please. And then the second one is, which action do you think should be prioritized by networks and partners involved in food systems to eradicate poverty, hunger, and address nutritional challenges in Africa? So please, audiences, you're welcome to participate. You've been unmuted, so you can participate. And you can put your video on. There's a message there from IT. Waiting. Okay, we have Florian there.
Yeah, I just felt like perhaps commenting on some of the things you said earlier on, Musa, around food processing. And I think one of the challenges really is to find ways of food processing that preserve the nutritional value of particularly local crops, because those are also likely to be the ones that firstly will perform better in small-scale agriculture, but also are likely to be more resilient to climate change impacts. And so I think currently a lot of the food processing benefits really large corporations, the big food that I've targeted in my presentation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so, nor does food processing necessarily have to be a negative thing. I think it's really one of the technical challenges then to figure out how can food processing technologies be adapted to really support opportunities for small-scale farmers, small-scale food processors, informal traders, and so on, in a way that maintains the nutritional value of food, but ensures that it can also be long-lasting on shelves, that it's easily traded and distributed, and that it is attractive to consumers. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done.
Thank you, Florian, for that point. Yeah, we're still waiting for the poll questions. Maybe we can, okay. So, yeah, we can proceed. Yeah, our IT, our administrators have put on the food security and nutrition webinar. To what extent do you think the recent unrest? 0% are saying no impact, 11%, 3 out of 28 are saying little impact, etc. Okay, maybe I can, so there's also, oh yeah, of course, 79% saying that, yeah, 1% says that they absolutely honestly say that personally, I don't see how the recent unrest affected production and packaging. The main component was the distribution, definitely yes. But in cases where you had maybe the transport of goods, logistics being affected, that could have been, but then we know that these big companies, as Florian said, the big 4 companies will have everything in place and will not be affected by these disturbances. And also another point that Florian raises is about processing the fruits and vegetables so that we retain nutrients as much as possible. We know that when we look at other parts of Africa, not necessarily South Africa, where you get seasonal production of lots of fruits and vegetables, but they have no means of preserving them. There is a season of plenty, then the rest of the year there's nothing. So processing does have its role to preserve those food products, whether it's by canning, by drying, or by freezing. That is, if you have access to electricity for the dry season where there's no crops or the food is in short supply. So yeah, the floor is open, audience. Maybe we can go back to our panelists. Okay, yeah, there's further significant impact. Some are not sure. So maybe we can go to our second question, which is, which action do you think should be prioritized by networks and partners involved in food systems to eradicate poverty? Okay, we have a comment in the chat section. It says that Yeah, the main component was distribution, definitely. And Amish has posted that access to more modern preservation techniques is a huge point, and it's true. Of course, the most preferably is to have your fruit fresh and have your vegetable fresh. But in instances where you cannot have them fresh, you have to process them. And of course, processing techniques and food preservation techniques are huge. And there was also a question posted on GMO and about too much chemicals applied to some fruits and veggies, and that limit people to buy such goodies in countries such as South Africa. I don't know, Melody, do you want to tackle that question? Or Florian on the GMO?
Yeah, there was a question that was raised there, both in the chat and also in the actual Q&A function around the GMOs, and it's a really contentious issue here. And I think it's often in these kinds of cases that we get a whole bunch of different things mixed up in people's reasoning. And I think we have to distinguish between the technology itself, other technologies linked to the core technology, and the social context of the technology. So I'm going to start with the last bit. The social context of GMOs currently is that they're mostly under the control of large multinational seed corporations who have very often invested in research that takes seed varieties that have been cultivated for many, many generations by indigenous farmers, and then selects particular qualities from them, and then basically patents those for their own, to privatize those profits, really. And so in a way, that's a way of enclosure of the commons in order to extract and accumulate value. And that is a problematic thing from the perspective of poverty and inequality and so forth. Then in terms of the technology itself, it is unclear from a public health perspective at this stage whether GMOs are safe. It hasn't been conclusively established that they are safe. And so there are still doubts, and there are many different perspectives in that. And until we are absolutely certain that something is safe, the precautionary principle would suggest that from a public health perspective, we should be very cautious about releasing such a technology into broad consumption. For me, though, one of the most concerning issues is the technology connected to GMOs, which is the widespread use of glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is a herbicide which is used to predictably accelerate the ripening process of particularly of grains such as maize and wheat, so that they can be mowed in time to fit with big agribusinesses' schedules. The problem with it, though, is that glyphosate has very well-known cancer-causing side effects. And as far as I'm aware, our food is not being tested for glyphosate residues. And this is really a question for food scientists, and particularly for food safety and food control scientists, whether it isn't sensible to actually conduct some really broad-scale surveying of commonly consumed foods, such as mielie meal, such as bread, to test it for glyphosate residues, because that could constitute significant public harm.
Thank you, Florian, for that. Yeah, we have a follow-up question which says, so what are some of the reasons why organic fruits and veggies are so expensive? Of course, we know why. They are in demand, first and foremost. So Florian, maybe Melody, can you unmute Melody or Lindiwe? So that question comes from Chance. It says, what are some of the reasons why organic fruits and vegetables are so expensive? I suppose we could start by defining what is organic. There's no use of pesticides or chemicals or fertilizers. Everything is natural. And you know that natural, the production cycle is slower, and obviously even the volumes. But when you add fertilizers, the volumes tend to increase. And of course, one can argue and say that traditionally all our fruits and vegetables were organic, but did we produce such large amounts? If you look at an apple now, it's so big, but whereas an organic one would be much smaller. Yeah, thank you for those questions.
So
yes,
I've been
Florian, you
asked to
can
respond
go.
to that
Yeah,
with regards
okay.
to the organic stuff. So I think it's important to bear in mind first that organic is a certification standard. And in fact, that's a big part of the reason why it is expensive, because very often the certification requires international organizations to come and visit a farm and establish that this farm, in fact, is producing according to those standards. And that adds a huge cost. It's really restrictive. It's not something that small farmers can easily afford to do. There are alternative certification schemes, peer-based certification schemes, which allow organic farmers to certify each other for adhering to these standards, but they aren't yet widely adopted. The other thing you've already mentioned, I think, is in terms of the volumes. I think, you know, small farms often are involved in producing organic foods and they produce smaller volumes, but they also entail a lot more labor. They're more labor intensive because more people are involved. Whereas on commercial farms, much of the work is done by machines and by chemicals. Organic farms, you tend to have people involved in weeding, in taking care of pests and so on. So that is another reason why it is in many cases more expensive, but then ultimately also it's a luxury product, which is being bought primarily by urban elites as part of a way to profile themselves. And in my view, also, it's quite a bit of virtue signaling that's going on there. And as you've pointed out, most traditional agriculture would qualify as organic if it were to be certified. So I think it's again, it's a distortion as a result of market forces and capitalism ultimately.
Okay, thank you, Florian, for that answer. Yes, our audience is very happy with that. That's Amish. There's also a question, this one is directed at Melody. It says, what can the networks do to lower food prices? Is there impact on food availability?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think when we say the networks, it's also important to define what we mean by which networks can do that. I mean, from our perspective, as the research network, FSNet Africa, for example, as a network of researchers, our one role we could play there is, of course, to make sure that we do high quality research that is relevant and actually timely and context specific, that the research is useful in the sense that it could actually be applied to do several things. You know, one is to understand, and then the other is also to look at modeling the ways that changes in one aspect influence on the other, because I think the question pointed out very nicely that X here influences then availability and access. So from a research network perspective, researching food systems, it's about being able to do that research, but really understanding it in context. But then, of course, there are several other kinds of networks. And I think Florian pointed out a really nice example of the communities of practice that they have. That in itself is also a type of network, bringing people together, bringing people to actively participate in dialogues and in processes where there is opportunity to contribute in spaces that can possibly bring about change. So I think that's maybe two perspectives of two different kinds of networks and different ways that they could play a role in ensuring affordability. And because we do know that affordability has this knock-on effect for things like access. And then that knocks on to so many other things. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Melody, for that answer. We also have a follow-up question from Oh yeah, sorry, it's moving up so very, very fast. Okay, maybe I'll read this one. It's thanking the panels as due to income. Thanking the panelists for delivering insightful presentation, much appreciated. But due to the occurrence of high income and inequality in the country, food and affordability becomes one of the biggest challenges, particularly in rural areas. What mechanisms or strategies can local government implement in an effort to curb the challenges of household food insecurity and work towards achieving the targets for the SDG 2? I think, Lindiwe, do you want to hang that one? Because I noticed your presentation did touch on some of those aspects. Thank you, Lindiwe.
Thank you, Nomusa, and thank you to the question. Let me just go to it. What mechanism and strategies? Oh, okay. I think we do have the medium-term strategic framework, which can then be used locally by local government in order to see how to assist those local governments to effort to curb the challenge of households. I think together with the NDP and the MTSF, the medium-term strategic framework does break down how a local government and local municipalities are able to respond to the challenge of household food insecurity. Those would be the two frameworks I would suggest at the local levels.
No, thank you, Lindiwe. Florian, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. This is a good question that has been occupying me for the past decade or more. And it's complex because, as I mentioned also, the Constitution really sees food security as being a national and a provincial mandate. And so local governments struggle to take on that mandate, particularly small municipalities where there's often a capacity issue and a resource issue in terms of budgets. And people are also really worried about the Auditor General clamping down on local government in terms of expenditure that cannot be justified in terms of mandates. So it's tricky. But in fact, local government has a number of functions across most departments which shape the food system and food environments. So these functions entail how they regulate informal trade. They entail planning permissions. They entail how the urban edge is defined. They entail spatial management principles as to zoning, whether land is zoned agricultural or for commercial or for trading. Most local governments also have a function in terms of health, even though that's often a provincial function, but there's usually a local government function there as well. So there's a number of different local government institutions that are relating to food security, but very often they're working in very different institutions and in many different directions. So one of the bigger kind of global conversations there is to, again, pull together networks of state officials from all these different departments to form food policy councils at the local scale that then partner with NGOs and civil society organizations to establish what are the actual local issues, because each local municipality will have its own challenges, and to then work out solutions together in partnership that then address the local capacities, local challenges, and so forth. But really developing democratic networks to address these problems locally is probably the first and most powerful step that can be taken, apart from national government saying local government has a mandate. That's perhaps the first and most important step at national government level.
Okay, thank you, Florian. There's also a question for Lindiwe. It says, how inclusive is the dialogue on food security policy in South Africa? Who is invited to the debate and who is excluded? Lindiwe, I suppose you can read that from the question and answer session.
It says I can't start my video.
Try now.
Okay, so to answer that question, I would use the 2013 National Policy on Food and Nutrition Security, and its overarching aim seeks to provide guiding frameworks to maximize synergy amongst the different strategies and programs. So everyone is involved, everyone is invited, including particularly both government and civil society. So the aim is to get everyone around the table, both government, civil society, the private sector, academia, to get a holistic response to respond or to address this, what we're talking about on food security policy. Answering Sonwabo.
Okay. And there's also a question from Nyanga Diniso, which say, well, she or he thanks the panelist, but he says, how accessible is the market retailing for the primary producers from rural areas? And he's concerned about the number of street vendors on fresh produce in the Eastern Cape, and where they've seen that what can be done to support such endeavors, and is worried about food spoilage risks and contamination that can easily demoralize venturing on such. Who wants to handle that one? Okay, yeah, the question is about the street vendors who are selling fresh produce on the streets. Yes, of course, that will pose, well, there's the issue of spoilage, which leads to food waste. And we have food losses and food waste. By the time you are selling a product, if it spoils before you sell it, is food waste. And also the issues of contamination or just unhygienic conditions, especially if you are selling at the side of the road, because do you have access to toilets, clean washing hands? Now with COVID these days, you also worry about that a lot. I suppose a lot can be done, especially by local governments, in terms of promoting areas where you can package your food product before they go out and sell it. And there's the issue of unit refrigeration as well. And there are more questions. Who wants to handle that as well? Yeah, Lindy.
Nomusa, I see the question from Bakang. Is your current food security policy in line with UN SDGs? Secondly, so I'll answer that one. Yes, it is. So when I shared on the SDGs, it was also requesting us to see the SDGs from the lens of our National Development Plan, right? To see that the NDP and the SDGs are very much aligned, 74% alignment. So yes, I would answer your question that the national policy is very much aligned with the global UN SDGs or Agenda 2030.
Okay, thank you. We're really now having a robust conversation on our cards, but because of we're cognizant of time, we should start wrapping up. Maybe I can just look at the last question. I think it's Linus Frank. He says, big food appears to be blamed for many of the major problems in South Africa. Isn't that a simplification? SA is highly urbanized and food production systems take place in different seasons, which is true. But we should think the major retailers will have access to diversity of fresh food year-round, though not affordable at all. Definitely not affordable because some of them has to be imported, so it makes it very expensive. The big retailers' first interest is to make money. The point that was raised by Florian. I don't know, Florian, do you want to handle that one? And then we can wrap up. We'll give over to Sasta.
Yeah, I was actually busy typing a response, but maybe it's easier if I just speak it. I think that's a really good point. I think one needs to be careful about oversimplifying and polarizing the debate. Big food is here. I think it's here to stay. And I think we need to recognize that. And also that big food has developed certain technical innovations and advantages, which meets needs of many consumers. However, their basic orientation is to maximize profits and to increase the market share of their business. They create a really competitive environment, which makes it really difficult for small producers, processors, or retailers to compete. And so there is need to regulate big food more aggressively. I don't think it's a matter of banning them. I don't think anyone really wants that. I don't think it's possible. But I think it's really a way of saying, okay, how can we work with this force in a way that it can benefit more people, that the benefits are shared more equitably, and that there is space for the smaller people. And I think it's really also useful to keep in mind that we forget, coming from a South African perspective, that there are other ways. And my colleague Mark Wegerhof at UP has done some research in Dar es Salaam, I think it's Tanzania, which is also a metropole of many millions of people, which are supplied through small-scale agriculture and small-scale local processing. So it is possible to supply large urban populations through means that are not as centralized and not as technologically sophisticated as ours. And similarly, the case in Kumasi in Ghana. So I think we can look to other parts of Africa to learn a lot about how decentralized networks of producers and processors can supply large urban communities without having to empower these centralized corporations in such a way.
Thank you, Florian. I think now we wrap up, definitely. And yeah, I see there are quite a number of questions that are coming in. I will have to hand over to our organizers, Sasta, to give the closing remarks. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for your participation, and yeah, and truly we are really appreciate. And again, the presentations and links will be shared with you, as Susie has pointed out. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nomusa Dlamini, for handing over to us as the organizers. Good afternoon, everyone. Name is Sizwe Khoza from SASTA in the Science Communication Division. And really, my role is really simple: to thank all of you, offer a vote of thanks to everyone who's been critical in putting together this webinar. You know, it's been obviously an effort that has taken weeks from our side, as well as our collaborators as well. But it has happened, you know, and we are quite thrilled about that. And we are really excited that, you know, things seem to fall into place this afternoon. So yeah, a very stimulating engagement, very thought-provoking from our panelists, you know, and also from the audience as well, in terms of, you know, the questions that have been posed, and also, you know, what is coming out of this in terms of looking at ourselves and saying, you know, what role do we have to play in terms of, you know, some of the issues that have been raised today. Florian did mention that, you know, there are issues that, you know, characterize the corporates in terms of marketing their food, for example, and what is the role of us as the citizen in terms of changing that as well, and changing the policy as well as the governance as well around food systems and food security. So this has really been quite an interesting discussion for me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, enjoyed the questions that have come from the audience again, you know, and again, I emphasize, you know, we would not have had this opportunity to, you know, to put together this presentation without our partners. And just to mention a few, you know, and convey my gratitude as well to those partners, DSI for giving us the platform, Department of Science and Innovation for giving us the platform in making sure that this webinar happens today and on this week, which is very important for us in the National System of Innovation calendar. The National Science Week is really important to DSI as well as to SASTA as well. So we are truly appreciative of that opportunity. And secondly, to the SASTA team as well, who have put together this event of National Science Week across all units, you know, from us as the Science Communication Division to the science awareness, science education, monitoring and evaluation. We are truly grateful for all their inputs into what they've done for this week. And obviously, as I mentioned, putting together, giving us the opportunity as well to have this webinar. Special welcome, special, tribute to Kiribone, who's been really working hard behind the scenes in my team to make sure that all the speakers are provided with all the information and making sure that we connect everyone to make sure that, today is a success. So thank you so much, Kiribone, for the good work. And again, most importantly, the speakers, and really for great things, taking the time to prepare for this webinar, from your busy schedule to participating in the webinar, providing inputs as well, into the initial concept document that we have. And then again, today, taking the time out to be part of this webinar. It's really interesting and, as I said in the beginning, thought-provoking, and it really asks a question around what can I do as well, from a citizen, to make sure that we change the way things are at the moment. So thank you so much to all these individuals, and more importantly as well to our moderator for setting the scene, making sure that we are all on the same page from the get-go. Thank you so much, Dr. Nomusa Dlamini from the CSIR. We are really appreciative of the effort that you put in behind the work as well, in agreeing to moderate the session. To our audience, thank you for attending and contributing to the discussion. We are certainly looking forward to more follow-ups. We are, as Nomusa has said, putting up the presentation on our SASTA website, but they will also be shared as well to all who have registered or all who have maybe attended this session as well. Thank you so much. I don't want to take too much time. I see we are almost ready to hit our end time. So just last comments from my side. Thank you to all for the engagements and making sure that the webinar has been a success and that we have different viewpoints to